Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Whittington. I'm a field crops educator with MSU Extension. And this morning, I'll be your host for the virtual breakfast today. I'm excited to host this morning, joined by Dr. Erin Burns and Jeff Andresen. Erin is an assistant professor at MSU and is an expert in integrated weed management in Michigan. Erin focuses on emerging problematic weeds in Michigan cropping systems. So without further ado, Erin, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Please feel free to share your slides and we'll go ahead and get started today.
Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's having a good morning. And today we're going to focus on post-emergence weed control, which I always know sounds kind of silly when you may not have planted yet, but by the time it rolls around for post-emergence weed control, you will be prepared. So I like to think of weed control programs having two phases. Short-range goals are to manage weeds this year. So we'll talk about some approaches of when to time that post-emergence weed or herbicide application to maximize crop yield. And then the long-range goal of your program should ultimately deplete the weed seed bank. And at the end of this talk, I'll talk about what the seed bank is and how we go about trying to deplete it. So how do we avoid yield loss? There's really two phases for that short range goal, that in-season goal. The first is overall to have a comprehensive weed control program. So this is starting clean, applying a full rate of a pre-emergence herbicide that has a residual component that's going to control weeds for a few weeks after you apply it. And this was largely the focus of Christy Sprague's virtual breakfast, which is on March 30th. And the link is on the screen. I'll put it in the chat box later if you want to remind yourself about what those early season weed control reminders are. But today I'm going to be talking about the next phase, which is effective post-emergence herbicide options. And really timing is everything. And we're going to demonstrate how important that timing can be to maintain the maximum yield possible. So the first question I'm going to ask you, you can think about this sitting at home with your coffee, are when weeds should be controlled. This was a study in corn to prevent yield loss. Should we wait till the weeds are 2 inches tall, 4 inches tall, 6 inches tall, 9 inches tall, or a foot tall? So think about your scenario and when you try to target those post-emergence herbicide applications, and we'll see what that ended up being with the maximum crop yield you can get. So when you're thinking at home, hopefully you chose your timing. And this was a study that looked at over 34 different site years across a number of states in the Midwest. And what they did is they waited to control weeds in corn until they were 2 inches tall, 4 inches tall, 6 inches tall, 9 or 12, and then looked at what the yield was and compared that to the yield of the weed-free plots for the duration of the season. So if we controlled weeds when they were just 2 inches tall, we had 100% of the yield that we would expect. So the same as if we controlled weeds throughout the whole year. But if we waited till they were 4, 6, or 9 inches tall, we start to see a yield drop. So about 3%, 6%, 9% of yield loss due to controlling those weeds when they were too tall. And then if we wait till a foot, now we're only at about 78% of what our yield potential could be if we control those weeds throughout the duration of the season. So if our target is maintaining 100% yield, then we'd want to control those weeds when they were 2 inches tall, which are pretty short. Usually we say 2 to 4 inches is a good goal, but this can be pretty difficult for a number of reasons. And the first are that weeds can grow anywhere from 2 to 4 inches per day, or 2 to 4 inches per week. So if we think about that as about 3.5 days on average. From this study, they found that the yield loss is about 0.9 bushels per acre per day. So we start to think about what does that mean in dollars and cents, and what keeps us out of the field from spraying. And there largely are environmental factors. So Jeff will talk about this later and tell us what's up for the next week, but large precipitation events are coming more common. This can keep us out of the field from timely spraying, especially post-emergence herbicide applications. Or from planting. This is a view out of my office on Tuesday with the lovely snow that we got here in East Lansing. Also, our seasons can be pretty windy. This keeps us all from timely herbicide applications and spraying those weeds when they're about 2 inches tall to maintain that weed control. So if we put $1 to that, if we delay our application by 2 days, we can lose about $6 per acre, depending on what you're ending up selling your crop at. So you can lose costs pretty quickly by not having good weed control. So when do we want to think about how do we apply these post-emergence herbicides, and what do we want to think about? I mean, I'm not going to go over specific herbicide options. I'll give you a link to a weed control guide at the end, or if you have questions about specific weeds, but really generalized approaches that you'll be able to apply to whatever field crop you're growing this upcoming season. And the first are weed growth rates. So weeds often grow pretty slow initially. So right now they're growing slowly, and then once we get those warm weather, so for post-herbicide application, we can have some pretty warm weather when we're applying those. We can have some pretty rapid growth. So an example of that is horseweed or mare's tail. This starts off as a rosette, that small plant close to the ground, and then they bolt, they send up that stem, and that can happen quite quickly, and those plants can get pretty tall, and now you're outside of that range of when that herbicide will be effective and when you're actually maintaining yield. And then our aggressive pigweed species in the state, such as water hemp or Palmer amaranth, there's been studies that have been shown that water hemp can grow to an inch to a quarter per day, and Palmer can grow up to 2.5 inches per day, which is pretty amazing growth rate. So when we're trying to control weeds when they're small, and if we do have one of those events that keeps us out of the field, then you can think about if these weeds can grow 2 inches per day, they can get quite tall pretty quickly and outside the range that we're trying to target them at. But crop growth stage often is another thing that we need to consider when we're applying these post-emergence herbicides. And this is a table from our weed control guide, and we have this in for each one of the crops, either in a table like this or other information. And that has the different herbicides, the maximum heights to control those weeds on the label for different weeds that are common in our state. And then this is from the corn section, so the minimum crop height, if there is one. There are certain herbicides you have to wait till the corn emerges to apply, or the maximum corn height. So the first line on the table is 2,4-D, and I'm going to show some pictures of what happens if you apply 2,4-D too late. So the maximum height's 8 inches. We'd recommend a little shorter than that. Most people will say that corn should be about the height of a pop can. And this is because when the crop gets too tall, this is influenced by how well they can actually metabolize that herbicide. So this was a photo. It'll come up on your screen. Mine is totally... There we go. Of corn that was applied, 2,4-D was applied too late in the season, so these plants were too tall. And on the left-hand side of your screen is the severe scenario in which these plants are completely, the corn plants, for those who can't see, are just flattened onto the ground. Little recovery may happen. On the right-hand side, these plants were a little bit smaller. This is a field that was planted a little bit later on in the season, but you can see there's very tight corn leaves that are very they're furled very tightly, and then when these actually unroll, they might be bright yellow, sometimes white, because that part of the plant hasn't been photosynthesizing, so that can look kind of like different stripes throughout your field. But these plants will recover. But just keep in mind, this is something that may happen if you don't pay attention to those crop height restriction or stage restrictions. And then also when we're thinking about applying post-emergence herbicides, we want to know what we're going to be planting next year and ensure that if we're applying a residual herbicide along with our post-emergence pass, which is quite common, that we're within the rotation restrictions for the various crops we're planning on planting the following year. So this is table 12 in the weed control guide, which goes over those various restrictions. But crop stage fails to consider anything about the weeds. So we went over in the beginning about how important it is to control those weeds when they're small, targets 2 inches up to 4 inches tall. So what happens when we don't really think about that? So weeds that emerge before the crop, this is more particularly important with our pre-emergence herbicides, or if you're doing a one-pass program in corn, just an early post application. If those weeds emerged prior to the corn plants, these are going to be the ones that are most detrimental to yield. They're already ready to compete with the corn plants for those limiting resources. So we want to make sure that if the weeds did emerge prior to our crop, that we don't wait too long to that maximum stage restriction to apply that herbicide, because those weeds will be too tall and have already done some damage. And then also when we're targeting post-emergence passes, we want to make sure that we actually have enough of the weeds up. So if we're applying a herbicide that has no residual, so something like Roundup or glyphosate, it's only going to kill the weeds that have emerged at that particular time point. So if you go in too early and there's no weeds that are up, you won't have any long-term duration of weed control. So keep in mind, if you're just putting in a post-emergence herbicide, it doesn't have any residual, that timing that to the maximum weed emergence is important. And then next, I'm going to switch gears for kind of the last part of the talk to look at how weeds actually reduce yield. So we know when we want to control them about 2 inches tall, some strategies to go about how to target those smaller weeds. And now what actually happens? How are weeds actually reducing yield? Well, we know weeds can compete for a number of resources. The first is light. This is particularly important in the beginning part of the season, when those plants are just trying to establish and grow. Light is a very key factor. Water is also very important. Depending on what kind of summer we have, we can have conditions in which we don't see precipitation for a few days, up to a few weeks, and the weeds can be pretty good at taking that away from our desired crop plant. And then nutrients, which is what I'm going to touch on briefly here. So I talked about this study last year, but I wanted to expand it a bit based off of the first slide that Kurt Steinke had on his talk a few weeks ago, looking at fertilizer costs and how that might help you make a decision on what you're going to do with this in weeds. So this study was conducted on campus a few years ago, and what they did was they applied nitrogen at 4 different rates: 0, 60, 120, or 180 pounds of N per acre. And then they waited to control weeds at 4 different growth stages. So V2 or V3, which is about 2 inch tall weeds. Then they went to V4, which is 4 inch tall weeds. V5, 6 inch tall weeds, and then waited all the way to V6, which is 8 inch tall weeds, to control those weeds. And at the time that they controlled them, they sampled the corn plants and the weeds for nitrogen content. So this graph is a bit busy, but we'll walk you through it. So this was looking at what the cost of that application actually was, utilized by the weeds instead of by the desired corn plant. So I took these figures off of Kurt's slide from a few weeks ago. So nitrogen, this is in urea, in 2020 was the lowest, cost about 39 cents per pound. Last year, 2022, is the highest, a little over $1. And then this year, the price is about 71 cents per pound. So in the middle of those two. So if we look at the range of costs overall, blue bars are 2020. So if we controlled weeds that were 2 inch tall, about $2 to $6 went towards fertilizing the weeds and not the actual corn plant. If we were in 2022 with those pretty high prices, this is anywhere from $7 to $18 per acre went towards just weed, feeding the weeds. And then 2023, about $5 to $12 in range. If we waited till 4 inch tall weeds or V4 corn, in 2020, that costs about $16 an average. 2022, now we're up to about $45, so quite costly. And then in 2023, projected amounts to be about $30 per acre. We wait till V5, now that cost of our N application going towards weeds is about $30 in 2020 costs. 2022, we're at about $80, and then into the 50s for this year. And then finally, if we wait till 8 inch tall weeds, V6, so pretty big weeds, now we're up towards $40 based on that lowest cost, over $100 with last year's prices, and then $75 with this year. So overall, you want to keep in mind these overall costs of what potentially could happen if you wait to control weeds too late, and what that could have on long-term control in corn. So fertilizer application rates are interconnected with weed control, and that's because they need these nutrients to grow. So if we delay or have poor weed control, this increases the potential that those weeds will compete and limit nitrogen availability for our crops. And if you're thinking about reducing weed control, just keep what I consider this hidden cost of weed control in mind, which are for some of these inputs that you're putting in to your crop. So keep in mind that that can have an implication also. And then the final thing I want to talk about today is the weed seed banks. The weed seed bank is the weed seeds that are in your soil. This is a history of what has gone on in your soil. There's a large number of ways those weed seeds can get in. So this is we'll keep track of your successes or failures, and knowledge can help us ultimately decide how to control those weeds. And then I didn't come up with this, but the idea of trying to target the weed seed bank is the exact opposite of what you would want to do with your own financials. And that is to maximize withdrawals. So take as much money, as much seeds out of the bank as possible and minimize deposits. So don't put new money, new weed seeds into the seed bank. And I just wanted to show a schematic on how easy this can happen. So palm amaranth or water hemp can produce over 1 million seeds per plant. The seeds live for about 4 years. And then common lamb's quarters, 500 seeds per plant. Longevity is about 40 years. Horseweed or mare's tail, 200,000 seeds per plant, only about 4 years of life. And then velvet leaf, 32,000 seeds, but 40 years. So if we take those in mind, we can have, if we have continuous control in corn or in any crop, in year one, we start off with 1 water hemp plant and 1 horseweed plant. Then in year 2, based off that soil seed bank, now we kill 99% of those plants, but we still have that 1% that can emerge. So we have 250 or 50, 250 water hemp, 50 horseweed. Year 3, 31,000 water hemp, 2,500 horseweed. And remember, this is 99% control each year. And if we control 99% of the weeds in year 3, year 4, now we have 4 million water hemp seeds, 125,000 horseweed seeds. If we then think about we can control 100% in corn and only 99% in soybean. So in year 1 in soybean, we still have 1 water hemp, 1 horseweed. We kill all those plants in the second year, but because of that weed seed bank, that reserve of weed seeds in soybean, now we have 93 water hemp and 19 horseweed in year 2. We then kill those all in the corn year, and then in year 3 in soybean, we have 4,000 water hemp, 300 horseweed, and then you can see how these numbers go up in year 4, 200,000 water hemp plants and 6,000. But overall, if we can get that level of control in corn, 100% and only 99 in soybean, we see over a 95% reduction. And I'll skip this last example just for time. But we want to tell you to save the date. Our weed control tour is on June 28th this year. We'll have more details to come, and in later virtual breakfast, share the link of how you can go about registering for that. And then this is just a snapshot of our website. I share this with all the weed scientists on campus. So Christy Sprague and others, and we have our research results, the 2023 weed control guide, and then any kind of fact sheet or other great information we might have. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we can go into Jeff's presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erin. That was an excellent presentation, very informative. Erin, we've got some great questions rolling into the chat. I hope you're ready to answer a few of them, or at least give it your best shot. I'll just start from the top in the order that they came in. Bill Stengel has a question. Can you speak to the percent total biomass of weeds versus crop relative to weed height? Tall weeds at low density compared to dense weeds at shorter heights.
So that's a great question. And it really comes down to, so if you're applying a herbicide to control those weeds, what height they're effective at. So we get worried about having too tall weeds just simply because when you apply that herbicide, it's not going to do as good as if those weeds were shorter. So even though that there's just a few of them, especially with whatever type of weed you're talking about, those could produce quite a few seeds, which could be really problematic the following years. So those tall weeds might have already done some damage to your in-season yield for this year, but have really big implications for the following years. And if you have a bunch of short weeds that are quite dense, that's when we also get worried about those, limiting nutrients and water is often a big thing that I see in our control plots on campus that have a lot of short, small weeds. Those weeds are just actively growing and taking away those resources from the crop. So if you have kind of a combination for both, you want to keep in mind that those tall weeds will just be too difficult to control if they get too tall, keep growing too tall. So you'd want to target those.
Yeah, excellent question, Bill. Dave has a question. Your thoughts on herbicide applications for wheat and weed control now that the weather is not allowing application, temperature and wetness.
Yeah, and then I mean, it asks to list a bunch of different weeds.
Yeah.
And how they're going to grow once they get warm, and then also how the wheat's going to keep going once it gets warm also. So I don't do weed control in wheat. Christy does, but I know that you need those temperatures to be 50 degrees or above for a few days. So that's kind of the key thing, is a few days to limit potential injury to the wheat plants. And then also you're up against some growth stage restrictions. So on our website, I know she's put together a fact sheet about spring weed control in wheat. I don't know if she's on or able to ping in on what might be some of your options depending on the growth stage that the weeds are at. But that would be something to check out. And the link was in the chat that you could find that fact sheet on.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see that, Erin, but it sort of goes on. The question goes on, the wheat is growing rapidly and it might not contact the weeds due to that active growing. And then based on Jeff's, climate prediction for the next week, it sounds like this could be sort of a problem for early weed control and wheat, maybe. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
So I think if it was too cold or is too cold and there's weed injury, and if the weed's gotten too big or is going to jump, you're mostly up against the growth stage, and then you need to probably think about how many gallons per acre of your water you're mixing with the herbicide to kind of get better coverage to get down through that canopy. But those would probably be two things to think about, is what you can even still apply once the wheat gets larger.
Okay, great. That's a good sound advice, good strategy. I think Dave has another question. Your thoughts on low temps and spraying broadleaf weeds and grass now for winter wheat?
Right. So the target has to be 50 degrees F for at least a few days at the day of application and afterwards. So you'd have to look at that target. And I know that's the part that's can often be the most difficult in the spring, is achieving that. So depending on where you are in the state, looking up what those temps are, and 50 is really our general target.
Is it too early and cold to spray Roundup and burn downs?
Same thing. So making sure we're warm enough. So 50, not just today, but for a few days afterwards. So that's going to be where we're going to run into issues. Roundup is a very slow acting herbicide. It can take up to 2 weeks to kill the plant, and the plants have to be actively growing. So the weeds have to be able to move that herbicide around within the actual plant to have maximum control. So if the weeds aren't growing during these burn down applications, we see reduced control, especially with herbicides like Roundup or glyphosate.
So I think everybody's kind of
it's a weird time where we have these, like, we've had a lot of warmth, and it snows, and we're back at it, up and down all over the place.
Yeah, the weather volatility is really making it sort of difficult to get in and do early control of weeds. 50 degrees seems to be the target for a lot of things. Dave has a question. The temperature restriction for wheat causes what damage to the wheat plant?
So the herbicide, so crops can tolerate herbicides because they can detoxify them to non-toxic compounds. So if the wheat or any crop isn't growing very well, those detoxifying enzymes aren't going at a rate that's quick enough to be able to detoxify them. So that's where you can see some injury symptomology. What that is based off of is probably like how severe that temperature is at the time and for how long afterwards, but reductions in growth and things like that can happen.
Yeah, great questions. They keep rolling in here. Rochelle, what herbicides would you recommend for the quickest results?
Guess it depends on what you're growing. I mean, if this is just a burn down scenario, it will really depend on what you're gonna plant, because there's some herbicides that you need to wait 7 to 14 days before you can plant a particular crop, and that. So we probably need a little bit more information.
Yeah, Rochelle, if you want to put maybe a crop down there, and I think Erin might be able to provide some specific information for your question. Good question. We've got no crop just to burn everything. Maybe just a general application of an herbicide.
I mean, so most times, depending on, this also depends if you have any herbicide resistant weeds, but Roundup or glyphosate's a pretty common one that controls non-selective, will control any weed that is out there. But once again, keep in mind these temperature, and all herbicides have a kind of a relationship with this temperatures that we're having.
So I've got a question for you, Erin, and this is just kind of more in general terms. Many regions across Michigan experienced a milder winter in terms of average temperatures this year. Any sort of implications in field crops this year for weed control? Just kind of that broad-based considerations.
Yep. So those winter annual weeds, so weeds that emerge in the fall and then overwinter and then come up in the spring. So often things like mare's tail and a few other our weeds will be growing quicker because they, had those, they didn't have that same period of cold over the winter like we normally did. So I'd keep an eye on winter annual weed growth right now. I know through the various parts of the state I've driven through, there can be some pretty dense fields. So those are the weeds that just because they established in the fall, they're ready to go this spring. And with those more mild temps, they're slightly larger than normal.
So if we're kind of experiencing a little bit of volatility with our weather right now, and we had a milder winter this year, it sounds like getting in and doing that early post-emergence weed control might be a little bit of a challenge this year. I mean, I'm not asking for a prediction, but it just kind of seems like things are pointing that direction.
And I would say if you haven't, most people haven't planted large, corn or soybeans yet, really focus on starting clean. So if that's tillage, if you till, or burn down herbicide application is the biggest thing. So starting clean early on, putting down a residual pre-emergence at planting, that gives you just a larger window ultimately to apply your post-emergence herbicide. So that wasn't really the focus of today, but those pre-emergence herbicides with residual are largely kind of an insurance policy to buffer against hopefully some of that early season volatility in our weather.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice, moving forward, given the volatility. I mean, we had those 80-degree temps a few weeks ago, and, if you didn't get your maybe early soybeans out at that time, it might be a good idea to lean into, what you just said, that early herbicide general application might be helpful here. Okay, Eric Anderson, are all families of herbicides equally dependent on air temperatures, including contact burners?
Okay, so that's a good question. So temperatures is one thing, and then sunlight is the other. So some of the contact herbicides, such as like gramoxone or a few others, they actually kill the plant by various photosynthetic parameters. So if those plants aren't photosynthesizing rapidly, those herbicides don't have the same impact as if they were. So they're kind of related, because normally if it's sunny, it's slightly warmer out here in Michigan than in other places I've lived. So for some of those contacts, you want to make sure that it's a nice sunny day to apply them. So keep in mind now sun and temperature.
Dave has another question. Post-emergence control of ragweed in dry beans. Ragweed seems to be resistant to reflex. Normally use Basagran at 1.5 PT and reflex. Lot of rags escape. Any other thoughts to control the resistant, even the non-resistant? Help ragweed is the biggest problem in dry beans.
That's a good question. I know Christy also focuses on weed control in dry beans. She'd be the better person to answer this. I know some of our ragweed species can get big pretty quickly, so lots of times we might think they're resistant and we just sprayed them too late, especially for dry beans. You're planting later in the season, warmer temperatures. But I'd have to look at the section of the weed control guide that goes over dry bean weed control, which is in there, and I know ragweed is a thing that's addressed within that to give you a better combination of herbicides, but focusing on height of those weeds is really key.
And you can find that information in that link that you shared.
Yep,
Erin, in
the
that
first
resource.
It's on a big tab on the front part of our website.
Perfect. Bill has a question. Any suggestions to increase speed of kill for winter rye with glyphosate additives or tank mixes?
So with glyphosate, for sure, you're going to be wanting to add AMS, at least 8.5 pounds per 100 gallons per acre to kill some of those cover crops, and then making sure that you have adequate spray coverage. So making sure your gallons per acre is up there, and that you're not trying to skimp on that, so we can get complete coverage on those plants. So that would be the biggest thing, is adding in AMS and then making sure that you're 19 or above for your gallons per acre for total application volume.
Excellent. We've got a little bit of time. If there's any other questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. You can enter the question in the chat box.
Steve, I do have a comment from Christofanzo. She's traveling and unable to unmute, but she mentions that there were high trap catches of black cutworms reported in last week's Purdue newsletter. She also said there's large numbers of true armyworm as well at some locations, including just south of the Michigan border. She's not seen anything in Michigan yet, so I think she's saying just be on the lookout for anything that might be out there.
Well, we do have a few minutes left, but if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up today's virtual breakfast. Again, please join us next week for the virtual breakfast series featuring Dr. Marty Chilvers on wheat foliar and head scab management. Thank you all for being here today. And if there's any questions, feel free to contact the Field Crops team or Phil. Have a good day, everybody.